The neon sign above Murphy's diner stuttered on and off, painting the wet pavement in sickly, tired light. Clara Martinez pulled her thin jacket tighter against the cold as she stepped into the night. 12 hours on her feet had left her exhausted. The diner's pay barely covered rent, and her little apartment's radiator did more coughing than warming. She checked her phone. It was late. The bus was gone. 40 minutes of walking home waited for her. She took the alley beside the diner, the shortcut she'd used 100 times. When something made her stop, a man lay curled against the brick, soaked and still. At first she thought he was another drunk, or someone who'd passed out, but his clothes were different. An expensive suit, shoes shined despite the puddles. He didn't belong in this part of town. Clara moved closer, voice small. "Sir, are you okay?" No answer. When she shook him gently, his head lolled to the side, revealing a young face that might have been handsome if not for the color of his lips and the whisper of shallow breaths. He might have been dying. Panic pushed through her. She checked his pockets for ID. There was cash, more than she'd ever seen at once, and a driver's license, Marco Duca. Tucked behind it was an unusually weighty card with only a single phone number and, in neat script, the words "in case of emergency." Clara stared at it for a long second and then, with hands that trembled, dialed. A deep voice answered, low, steady, and immediately in command. Clara told him what she'd found Marco Duca in an alley, barely breathing. There was a pause, then a single, hard question. "We're the Murphys. The alley. He's..." "Stay where you are. Do not move him. Do not call anyone else. I'm coming." The line went dead. Her first, panicked instinct was to call an ambulance. But something in the caller's tone left no room for argument. She covered the young man with her jacket and tried to keep him warm, counting seconds she felt sure would be his last. He had a pulse, faint, but there, and she watched for any sign of breathing. Engines cut through the night before she could decide what to do. Headlights flooded the alley, and several men stepped out, moving like a practiced team. At their center was the man who had spoken on the phone, older, tall, silver at his temples, every inch the kind of person whose presence demanded attention. He moved as if he owned the space itself. He dropped to his knees beside Marco and checked him with a grim efficiency that was almost clinical. "How long?" he barked. Clara told him what little she knew. He was suspicious, sharp, and within minutes had ordered his men to secure the alley. Then a doctor arrived, an older man with a medical bag far more sophisticated than anything Clara had seen at the neighborhood clinic. He worked fast and quiet. "Poisoning," the doctor said after a tense moment. "Not lethal. If someone had found him later, he wouldn't have made it." The older man's expression didn't soften. He studied Clara with a look that mixed suspicion and calculation. "You could have robbed him," he said quietly. "You could have walked on, but you called me." The words were part thanks, part accusation. Her throat tightened at the implication. "I would never," she managed. He leaned in, his voice dropping to an even colder hush. "You saw something tonight. That makes you dangerous. Walk away, forget this alley, forget his name. If your name is ever connected to mine, you won't be identifiable." He spoke like a promise and a threat at once. Then they were gone. Marco tucked carefully into a waiting car, his men folding up around him, and Clara was left standing in the rain, the sound of engines fading. For 3 nights she couldn't sleep properly. She worked more shifts, kept busy, and didn't tell a soul. But normal life doesn't hold. During a busy lunch at Murphy's, Janet, her co-worker, waved her over with gossip. A well-dressed man had asked for Clara by name. Clara's stomach dropped. Through the din, she could see a black sedan waiting outside. When she walked over, she recognized him immediately. Marco Duca sat at a booth, alive and handsome, his suit clean and his smile disarming. He stood as she approached. "Clara Martinez," he said. The name sounded formal, almost rehearsed. She kept it short, keeping one eye on Janet and the curious customers. He thanked her for saving him and handed her a plain white envelope. "A small thank you," he said. Clara pushed it back. She didn't want charity. He persisted gently, then, surprising her, asked her to spend an hour with him. "Just for a few hours," he promised. "I'll bring you home before your next shift." We pretend it never happened. She agreed. 1 hour. He drove her to a house that felt unreal: marble floors, chandeliers, art on the walls. It was all luxury and scale that made her stomach flip. Don Duca watched her like someone assessing a fragile object. Even under polite introductions, Don Duca said little. His eyes catalogued her. After the visit, the contrast of coming back to her neighborhood, cracked sidewalks and dim streetlights, hit Clara hard. She hadn't realized how foreign the Duca world felt until she walked back into the familiarity of the blocks she knew. Then the footsteps started. 3 men stepped out, closing off her path. The first spoke with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Pretty lady," he said. They had been waiting. They knew she'd been at the Duca house, and they wanted information: who lived where, how the mansion was guarded, what routines the family followed. Their tone made it obvious what would happen if she refused. Terrified, Clara insisted she knew nothing useful. The second man pulled a knife. She backed into a parked car, hands pressed against her chest. There was nowhere to run. Headlights screeched up the street, and 2 cars pulled to a stop. Men in suits poured out with the same military precision she'd seen before. Marco was at the front, different now, the charming diner patron replaced by someone whose voice made the attackers hesitate. "Gentlemen," he said, voice calm and cold, "you have something that belongs to me." Outgunned and outnumbered, the attackers retreated, and Clara felt her whole body unwind. Marco steadied her, asking if she was hurt. He explained they'd been watching her. His gratitude was real, but so was the reminder saving him had put her in danger. He couldn't allow anything to happen to her. She was taken not to a grim hideout, but to a penthouse overlooking the harbor. The place was quiet and secure, the kind of refuge that felt absurd after nights at the diner. "You'll be safe here," Marco said. "My men will watch the building." In the penthouse, he explained what had happened. The poisoning was a message. Someone close enough to slip a substance into his drink had done it. Not to kill, but to humiliate, to show that Don Duca's family was vulnerable. Marco's family had enemies, led by a rival named Victor Clov, but the twist was worse. Someone within their circle had betrayed them. The idea that the threat might come from inside left Marco furious and hollow at once. Clara listened, feeling both exposed and oddly pulled into his world. He told her how he'd been raised to carry a legacy, how relationships were transactions, how learning to trust was a luxury few in his life could afford. Yet with her it had been different. She'd helped without motive, and he'd noticed. That fact had rattled something in him. A few nights later they confronted the betrayal. In a concrete basement, under a single swinging light, a man named Tony Ricci sat tied to a chair, his face bruised. Don Duca's voice filled the room as he accused Tony of aiding their rival. There was no lengthy trial in that world. Betrayal was a sentence unto itself. The end was quick and final. Clara watched, sickened and sorrowful, as the consequences of that life unfolded. Back in the penthouse that night, The city glittered below like a different universe. Clara asked what she'd asked herself a dozen times since the alley. "Do you regret me being here?" He didn't answer with platitudes. He admitted the world he belonged to had brutal rules. He also admitted he wanted something different for himself. A life in which his choices weren't dictated by his name. "What would that look like?" Clara asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know I don't want a life where I wake up and don't recognize the person beside me." He told her he'd thought of walking away, of disappearing to a small place where nobody knew them. It sounded impossible. It sounded dangerous. It also sounded real when the phone rang in the small hours with news that confirmed betrayal and bloodshed. Marco prepared for what he called business. Clara wanted to go with him. He refused at first, but before long she insisted she needed to know everything if there was to be any future between them. He relented. The reality of Marco's world was harsher than she'd imagined. In a warehouse basement with men who knew how to break and to be broken, she watched justice, if that's the word, take its course. She understood then that loyalty in that life came at the cost of lives, and that leaving would mean more than walking away from money or power. It would mean leaving a history and people who depended on him. Afterward, on the penthouse terrace as dawn light began to soften the sky, Marco asked if she'd consider leaving with him. "If I left my father, if I tried to build something different, would you walk with me?" she asked. Clara thought of her cramped apartment, the radiator that coughed, the nights she'd gone to bed hungry for want of steady pay. She thought of Tony Ricci and the basement, of threats that had been whispered into her ear, and the men who had tried to corner her on a dark street. She thought, too, about Marco's gentleness in small moments, the way he'd thanked her, the way he'd said he wanted to be someone for her. "If you could really do it," she said finally, "I'd consider it." They stood there, both aware that there was no clean escape. Love would not erase the past, and leaving would come with risks none of them could fully map out. But the possibility of a different life, however slim, felt like more than she'd ever had. She kissed him then, not naive but chosen. The city below went on, indifferent. For Clara, the choice was simple and terrifying. Go back to what she had, or step into the unknown with a man who'd shown her a different kind of life and a different kind of danger. She chose to step forward.